The microphone stood in front of him like a challenge. Louis Armstrong sat on a stool in the recording studio, breathing heavily, his body betraying him with every inhale. It was August 1967, and the man who had once commanded stages with boundless energy could barely stand for more than a few minutes without his heart protesting, his kidneys failing, his body shutting down in ways his doctors could no longer ignore. They had told him to stop, to rest. To accept that at 66 years old, after 5 decades of constant performance, his body had given everything it had to give. But sitting in that studio, looking at the sheet music for a song called What a Wonderful World, Louis Armstrong made a different calculation. Not about his health, not about his career, but about what he needed to say before he ran out of time to say it. What nobody in that room understood, what even Louis himself might not have fully understood, was that he was about to record what would become one of the most beloved songs in history, and he would never live to see it happen. The song had come to Louis through Bob Thiele, a producer who believed that Louis Armstrong still had something important to offer the world. In 1967, that belief was increasingly controversial. The music industry had moved on. Rock and roll dominated the charts. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, these were the sounds that young people wanted. Jazz, and especially the traditional jazz that Louis represented, was considered old-fashioned, a relic of a previous era. Radio stations weren't playing Louis Armstrong anymore. His record sales had declined. Venues that once competed for his performances were now half empty when he appeared. The world that Louis had helped create had decided it no longer needed him. But Bob Thiele heard something different. He heard a voice that carried history, that embodied resilience, that could communicate emotion in ways that transcended fashion and trend. And when songwriters George David Weiss and Bob Thiele himself wrote What a Wonderful World, they thought immediately of Louis, not because the song was commercial, not because it would appeal to young audiences, but because the message of the song, their insistence on finding beauty in a world full of pain, seemed to embody everything Louis Armstrong's life had been about. They brought the song to Louis knowing it was a risk, knowing that his record label wouldn't like it, knowing that it might not sell, but believing it mattered anyway. Louis's first reaction to the song was complicated. He read the lyrics, those simple, almost naive words about trees of green and red roses too, about skies of blue and clouds of white. In 1967, America was being torn apart. The Vietnam War was escalating. Race riots were erupting in cities across the country. Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated the following year. The optimism of the early civil rights movement had given way to anger and disillusionment. And here was a song insisting that the world was wonderful, that babies crying meant they would learn much more than Louis would ever know, that the colors of the rainbow were in the faces of people passing by. It could seem disconnected from reality, willfully blind to suffering, a kind of musical sedative meant to comfort people rather than challenge them. But Louis understood something about the song that its critics would miss. It wasn't denying pain, it was insisting on beauty despite pain. It was the voice of someone who had seen the worst of humanity, who had lived through racism and poverty and discrimination, who had every reason to be bitter and cynical, choosing instead to acknowledge that wonder and horror could coexist, that you could know the world was broken and still find moments worth celebrating. That was Louis's entire life philosophy compressed into 3 minutes. And when he told Bob Thiele he would record it, he did so knowing that this might be his final statement, his last chance to tell the world what he'd learned from 66 years of survival. The recording session was scheduled for August 16, 1967 at Webster Hall in New York. Louis arrived looking older than his years, moving carefully, conserving energy. His doctor had advised against the session. His wife Lucille had expressed concern, but Louis insisted. The studio musicians, many of whom had worked with Louis before, were shocked by his appearance. The vibrant, energetic performer they remembered had been replaced by a man who seemed fragile, whose breathing was labored, who needed to sit rather than stand. During rehearsals, Louis would have to stop frequently, catching his breath, his face showing the pain he was trying to hide. The executives from ABC Records, Louis's label, hated the song. Larry Newton, the president of ABC, thought it was too slow, too sentimental, completely wrong for the market. He wanted Louis recording something upbeat, something that could compete with the rock songs dominating the charts. "This is career suicide," he told Bob Thiele. "Nobody wants to hear this." He tried to stop the session to convince Louis to record something else, something more commercial. But Louis, who had spent his entire career accommodating other people's demands, who had smiled through indignities and compromised when he had to, refused. "I'm recording this song," he said quietly. "This is what I came here to do." The recording began. Louis sat on his stool, the orchestra arranged around him, Bob Thiele in the control booth. The opening notes played, lush and romantic, setting a tone that felt out of time, that belonged to an earlier era of music. And then Louis began to sing. That voice, gravelly and warm, worn smooth by decades of performance, singing about trees of green and red roses too. The pain in his body was real. Every breath was an effort. Every phrase required him to manage his failing lungs, to push air through a system that was collapsing. But what emerged from that struggle was something transcendent. The voice cracked in places, wavered in others, but those imperfections weren't flaws, they were authenticity. They were the sound of someone giving everything they had left. In the control booth, Bob Thiele listened with tears streaming down his face. The engineers, hardened professionals who had recorded thousands of sessions, found themselves moved in ways they couldn't articulate. This wasn't just a recording. It was a testament, the sound of a man who knew he was dying, choosing to sing about beauty. The orchestra members, watching Louis struggle through each phrase, felt the weight of what they were witnessing. Some of them would later say it was the most emotionally powerful recording session they'd ever been part of, not because of technical perfection, but because of what it cost Louis to produce each note. The song builds to a climax with the line, "I think to myself, what a wonderful world." And when Louis sang those words, his voice breaking with emotion and physical exhaustion, something shifted in the room. It became clear that this wasn't just Louis Armstrong recording a song. This was Louis Armstrong making his peace with the world, acknowledging everything he'd survived, everything he'd seen, all the beauty and horror mixed together, and choosing to find it wonderful anyway. Not because it was objectively wonderful, but because the alternative, cynicism and despair, would be to let the darkness win. And Louis had spent his entire life refusing to let the darkness win. The session ended. Louis had given everything he had. He could barely stand when they finished. Lucille rushed to support him, her face showing the fear she'd been suppressing all day. Bob Thiele thanked Louis, his voice thick with emotion, knowing that what they'd just captured was special, but also knowing that the commercial reception would likely be disappointing. ABC Records, true to Larry Newton's prediction, barely promoted the song. They released it as a B-side, giving it minimal support, expecting it to disappear without notice. In the United States, What a Wonderful World flopped. It barely charted. Radio stations didn't play it. The rock-dominated market that Larry Newton had worried about proved exactly as hostile as he'd predicted. Louis, watching the song sink into obscurity, felt the sting of rejection. This thing he'd poured his soul into, this statement he'd made while his body was failing, the world didn't want it. The irony was crushing. His whole career, Louis had given audiences what they wanted. He'd smiled through segregation, performed in venues that treated him as less than human, accommodated demands that diminished him. And now, at the end, when he'd recorded something that mattered to him personally, something that expressed his actual philosophy rather than what was commercially viable, it had failed. But something unexpected happened in the United Kingdom. British audiences, perhaps less invested in the rock revolution, perhaps more open to Louis' traditional style, embraced the song. It went to #1 on the UK charts, staying there for several weeks. Louis, sick and disappointed by the American reception, found some comfort in knowing that somewhere in the world people were hearing his message. But he couldn't possibly imagine what would happen. Next, Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971 at his home in Queens, New York. He was 69 years old. His heart, which had carried him through 69 years of life and 5 decades of constant performance, finally stopped. The tributes poured in from around the world. Presidents and musicians, fans and critics, all acknowledging the passing of a giant. The obituaries detailed his innovations, his recordings, his impact on American culture. But What a Wonderful World was rarely mentioned. It was considered a minor late-career recording, not particularly important in the context of his massive legacy. 16 years passed, the world changed, the Vietnam War ended, the social upheavals of the 1960s gave way to different challenges. And in 1987, a director named Barry Levinson was making a film called Good Morning Vietnam. Starring Robin Williams as an irreverent armed forces radio disc jockey in 1965 Saigon. Levinson needed a song for a crucial scene, something that would capture the contrast between American idealism and the horror of the war, between hope and reality, between what soldiers were told and what they were experiencing. He chose What a Wonderful World. The scene in the film is devastating. Louis Armstrong's voice, warm and hopeful, singing about a wonderful world, played over footage of the Vietnam War's brutality. The juxtaposition created exactly what Louis' original recording had intended, a recognition that beauty and horror coexist, that you can acknowledge one without denying the other. The song, which had failed in America 20 years earlier, suddenly became inescapable. It climbed the charts. Radio stations that had ignored it in 1967 played it. Constantly, a new generation discovered Louis Armstrong through this song, and many didn't even know he was dead, didn't know he'd never seen its success. The song became ubiquitous. It appeared in commercials, in graduation ceremonies, in weddings and funerals. It became the song people reached for when they wanted to express hope in the face of despair, when they needed to remember that life contained beauty worth celebrating. Every time a baby was born, someone played What a Wonderful World. Every time a couple got married, the song was on someone's playlist. It transcended its origins to become something universal, a touchstone that multiple generations claimed as their own. But Louis Armstrong never knew. He died believing the song had failed, died thinking that his final statement, the thing he'd recorded while his body was collapsing, had been rejected by the world he'd spent his life entertaining. That tragic timing, that cosmic unfairness, makes the song even more poignant. Because what Louis was singing about, finding beauty in a world that won't give you what you deserve, finding wonder in a life that's been harder than it should be, that was embodied in the song's own journey. The world rejected it when Louis was alive, embraced it when he was gone. The message of the song, that beauty exists even when you can't see it yet, even when it seems impossible, became the story of the song itself. Today, What a Wonderful World has been streamed billions of times. It's one of the most recognized songs in human history. People who know nothing else about Louis Armstrong know this song. It's been covered by hundreds of artists, used in countless films and television shows, becomes a source of comfort to millions who are struggling to find reasons to hope. And every single performance, every single stream, every single moment someone uses that song to remind themselves that beauty exists, is a delayed thank you to a man who recorded it while dying, who gave everything he had left to create something he believed mattered, even though the world told him it didn't. The recording session on August 16, 1967, lasted less than an hour. But in that hour, Louis Armstrong, sitting on a stool because he couldn't stand, breathing with difficulty because his body was failing, recorded something that would outlast him by generations. The executives who thought the song was commercial suicide were right about the short term and completely wrong about the long term. The song did fail initially, but failure, Louis understood better than most, is sometimes just success delayed. Sometimes what you create finds its audience when you're not there to see it. Sometimes your gift to the world only makes sense years later when context has shifted and people can finally hear what you were trying to say. If Louis could have known, could have seen what a wonderful world would become, would it have changed anything? Would it have eased the pain of that recording session, the disappointment of watching it flop, the dying without knowing your final statement had mattered? Maybe. But maybe the song needed that pain to be what it became. Maybe the authenticity that people respond to, the feeling that Louis really means every word, comes from the fact that he was singing from a place of genuine struggle, genuine mortality, genuine uncertainty about whether anyone would hear him. There's a recording of Louis talking about death a few years before he died. Someone asked him if he was afraid, and Louis said something characteristic. "I've had a wonderful life. I've seen things and done things and loved people. When it's time to go, it's time to go. I just hope I leave something behind that makes people's lives a little better." He did. The song he recorded while dying, the song the world initially rejected, the song he never knew became beloved, that's what he left behind. Not just a recording, but a philosophy, a way of looking at the world that acknowledges pain but chooses to see beauty anyway. That admits life is hard but insists it's also wonderful. That understands you might not live to see your work appreciated but creates it anyway because it needs to exist. The doctors told Louis to stop recording, to rest, to accept that his body couldn't do what it once did. Larry Newton told him not to record What a Wonderful World, that it was career suicide, that nobody wanted to hear it. Louis's own declining health told him to save his energy, to not waste what little he had left on a song that probably wouldn't matter. But Louis recorded it anyway, sat on that stool and poured his failing body into a song about finding beauty in a broken world. And decades after his death, billions of people have heard what he had to say, have found comfort in his message, have used his words to remind themselves that wonder exists even in darkness. That's the song Louis Armstrong recorded while dying, not just What a Wonderful World, though that's what it's called, but something deeper, a song about insisting on beauty when everything tells you to give up, a song about creating even when you don't know if anyone will listen, a song about leaving something behind because it needs to exist, not because you'll be there to see it appreciated. A song about faith, not in divine intervention, but in the possibility that what you create might matter to someone somewhere someday, even if you never know it. Louis Armstrong died in 1971, believing the song had failed. But the song, like Louis himself, refused to let failure be the final word. It waited. It persisted. And when the world was finally ready to hear what Louis had been trying to say, when the timing was right and the context had shifted, the song he recorded while dying became the song that would never die, that would play at births and deaths and everything in between, that would remind generation after generation that even in darkness, even in pain, even when your body is failing, and the world is rejecting you, it's still possible to look around and think to myself, what a wonderful world. 16 years too late for Louis to hear it, but exactly on time for everyone who needed to hear it after. That's the tragedy and the triumph, mixed together like they always are, inseparable and somehow, against all odds, wonderful.